Fire. It's probably the one thing that pilots fear the most, and that's for very good reasons. When it first entered service back in 1972, the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was the most advanced airliner of its time. Designed to compete with the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, the three-engine wide-body TriStar was notable for a number of innovative features that wouldn't become commonplace in other aircraft until decades later. But that's a story for my other channel, because today I want to tell you about a flight on one of the airlines that operated this fascinating type, specifically Saudia, the state-owned flag carrier of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Saudi's L-1011s were primarily used for long-haul flights, but sometimes they were also utilized on a few domestic routes, particularly those connecting to Jeddah, home to the main airport for pilgrims headed to Mecca. In August of 1980, the Hajj pilgrimage season hadn't started yet, but Saudi's regular L-1011 service from Karachi, Pakistan to Jeddah via the Saudi capital of Riyadh was still fully booked. And on the 19th of August, the L-1011 operating Saudi Flight 163 departed Karachi at 16:32 Saudi time and arrived in Riyadh 2 hours and 34 minutes later. At that point, all of the passengers disembarked to go through customs clearance, something that they had to do regardless of their final destinations. Back in 1980, baggage inspections were a quite rudimentary affair with no x-rays or scanners like we have today, so passengers were just informed that certain items were prohibited to carry. But except for some bags that were open for spot inspections, there was not a lot of verifications that those rules were actually being followed. That meant that it wasn't particularly difficult to take dangerous goods onto an airplane, and that was, by the time, true for most parts of the world. On top of this, most passengers also didn't know the full list of prohibited items, which all meant that it wasn't uncommon for prohibited items like matches to sometimes ignite inside passenger luggage, especially during loading. Now, nobody knows exactly what was in the passenger luggage on this particular flight, but investigators would later discover several prohibited items, both in the cabin and in the cargo areas, including a can of diesel lubricating oil and a butane stove. So there definitely was some stuff that shouldn't have been on board on this flight. Now, because it's hard to completely exclude these kinds of prohibited items, even with modern scanning technologies, the L-1011, like all passenger aircraft, was equipped with a large number of fire detection and suppression systems. And those ones are important to explain before we get into what actually happened on this flight. Under international regulations, every compartment of an aircraft where items are stored, whether it's overhead bins, galley cabinets or cargo holds, are assigned with a fire protection class, depending on factors such as size and accessibility. A Class A compartment, like an overhead bin, doesn't have to have any fire suppression systems or smoke detectors, because a fire there would be obvious to the cabin crew, who could then put it out using their handheld fire extinguishers. Saudia's L-1011s were equipped with no less than 11 of those handheld extinguishers, which were scattered throughout the cockpit, galley and cabin in order for them to be able to retrieve as quickly as possible in case a fire would be detected. The next level of compartments are called Class B. These might not be readily visible to the crew, but can still be reached with a handheld extinguisher if needed. And because Class B compartments are more hidden, these type of compartments must therefore also be equipped with smoke detectors. Then comes Class C compartments, which most underfloor cargo areas fall under. These can't be accessed in flight and must therefore be equipped with both smoke detectors and built-in fire suppression systems that can be activated from the cockpit. However, some cargo compartments historically were also considered Class D. Now, if you look up modern guides to cargo compartment classes, you'll see that the list goes straight from Class C to Class E, skipping over Class D, and the reason for that will become very clear by the end of this video. But back when Class D compartments were still a thing, this label applied to any compartment that was considered fireproof, in that there were means to ensure that a fire would starve itself of oxygen and self-extinguish before it could escape from that compartment. Because Class D compartments were by definition fireproof, there was actually no requirement that these compartments had any extinguishing systems or even any smoke detectors. And the L-1011's C3 baggage compartment, located underneath the left aft part of the passenger cabin, was at that time considered Class D. Now, this C3 compartment was approved for animal transport, which meant that it was pressurized and ventilated during flight, and that ventilation could provide a steady supply of oxygen in the case of a fire. Therefore, in order to meet the Class D requirements, Lockheed had fitted the compartment with 2 redundant smoke detectors and also a cut-off system that would restrict ventilation air to the compartment if either of those detectors indicated the presence of smoke. This compartment was also fitted with a Nomex fire-resistant liner that was designed to be able to withstand the heat of a fire until all of the oxygen in the compartment was used up. At least that was the idea. You see, when the regulations for Class D compartments were originally drafted in the United States back in the 1960s, the authorities had to specify exactly how much airflow was too much. In other words, how much airflow would keep the fire burning and therefore be unacceptable. Now, the final rule didn't end up specifying maximum airflow rates in a systematic way. Instead, it suggested that 1500 cubic feet per hour was an acceptable maximum for a 500 cubic foot big compartment. The idea was that if the air volume inside that compartment was replaced 3 times an hour or less, then the inflow of oxygen would be too slow to keep a fire burning. Hence, the Class D requirements would be met. However, in the years following the creation of this regulation, new wide-body aircraft began to enter service with cargo compartments much larger than 500 cubic feet. In fact, the C3 compartment on the L-1011 was a full 700 cubic feet, and some compartments on other aircraft, like the 747, were even bigger than that. Now, in order to determine the maximum permissible airflow rate in a 700 cubic foot Class D compartment, Lockheed and the FAA simply extrapolated the suggested 3 times per hour rule and concluded that as long as the airflow was less than 2,100 cubic feet per hour, the compartment would still be fireproof. And since there was a cut-off system designed to completely exclude any ventilation air from the C3 compartment, the actual airflow rate in the event of a fire would be close to 0. So that would mean that the compartment would be well protected, right? Well, as it turns out, not really. You see, what the certification analysis didn't take into account was the fact that a 700 cubic foot compartment holds about 40% more oxygen than a 500 cubic foot compartment does to begin with, no matter what the airflow rate is. And nobody had thought of testing whether the standard materials used for fireproof liners could withstand a fire that had access to 40% more oxygen and could therefore burn for much longer. And that's worth remembering. This story is one of the most mysterious and dramatic ones in aviation history, but as you will soon see, it will highlight the critical importance of preparedness and quick thinking. Being able to adapt to new and sometimes stressful situations is key in building resilience, and a foundation of making that possible is knowledge. This is why I am so happy that this video is sponsored by Brilliant, an absolutely fantastic learning tool for all ages. Brilliant was actually the first ever sponsor that believed in what I was doing, and both me and my son have been using them ever since in order to learn STEM subjects in a fun and interactive way. Brilliant offers loads of super engaging courses where they use visual lessons in order to make complex concepts easy to grasp, something that I have really been taking in, and maybe you've noticed that on this channel. The courses are made to sharpen your problem-solving skills and make you an overall better thinker. And one course that I would definitely recommend to you guys is How LLMs Work. If you take up that one, it will deepen the way that you understand large language models like ChatGPT, making them less of a mystery and more of a powerful tool for you to use, like how I integrated it into my app Mentour Aviation. So if you want to start leveling up your skills and knowledge today, head over to brilliant.org/mentorpilot, click on the link here in the description or scan this QR code. That will give you 30 absolutely free days to test Brilliant out, and then 20% off their annual subscription if you like it. Thank you, Brilliant. Now let's continue. The pilots operating Flight 163 on that evening had, of course, no idea about this vulnerability about their cargo holds, nor did anyone else for that matter. But there were some other real issues with this crew that we have to talk about in order to understand what ultimately happened. The captain was 38 years old and had at the time of this flight over 7,600 hours of total flying time. He had operated several different types, including the DC-3, DC-6, DC-9 and the 737, but he had only recently upgraded to the Lockheed L-1011, which meant that he only had flown about 388 hours on it by the time of this flight. But the real issue was actually his training record. It indicated that he had difficulty with tasks to vary from a set pattern, was often behind the aircraft, was slow to learn, needed more training than normal, failed recurrent trainings and had shown problems when upgrading to new aircraft. Now, a competent and experienced first officer could have possibly mitigated some of those issues, but unfortunately the pairing on this particular afternoon was a very unfortunate one. You see, the first officer was 26 years old and had a total of 1,615 hours. And he had only been checked out on the Lockheed L-1011 12 days before this flight, meaning that he only had a total experience of 125 hours on it, even less than the completely new captain. And to make matters even worse, there were records showing that he probably shouldn't have even been in that cockpit in the first place. You see, the first officer had started his flight training back in November of 1974 at a facility in Miami, but in September the following year, that training center had sent a telex to Saudia advising them of his overall poor performance. In response, Saudia recommended that he should be dropped from the training program, which he also was in October that same year. But then, a year and a half later, in March of 1977, he was reinstated as a result of, quote, committee action, alongside with several other dropouts. Now, the report doesn't explain what committee action means, and there has been quite a lot of interpretations of that phrase over the years, but one of the most common ways of reading it is that he leveraged some kind of personal connections in order to get reinstated. The report also doesn't specify what the first officer struggled with when he was in training, which had then caused him to get dropped in the first place, but what I want to emphasize here is that this kind of reinstatement of a trainee who has previously failed a lot, in most cases, really isn't a great idea. The decision to stop a cadet's training is never taken lightly, and to overturn that is to ignore the, no doubt, very good reasons why that trainee was originally dropped. Anyway, since this flight was being operated on an L-1011, there was also a third crew member, a flight engineer, and as it turns out, his history was just as problematic. He was 42 years old and came originally from the United States. At the time of the flight, he had amassed about 650 hours in the flight engineer position, but only 157 of those had been operated on the L-1011. Now, when he originally joined Saudia, he had started out as a captain on the DC-3 already back in 1974. Then, in March of 1975, he had moved on to a first officer role on the Boeing 737, for which he attended training at the United Airlines Training Center in Colorado. But he ended up being terminated from that program due to an overall unsatisfactory progress. In January of 1977, he again attempted to upgrade to the Boeing 737 at a different training center, and this time he successfully passed and therefore joined the line in June of 1977. But already in March the following year, he failed a check ride so badly that the Saudia training department recommended that he should be removed from the line altogether. 1 week later, he was fired, but he appealed his termination and asked if he would be allowed to try out as a flight engineer instead. This appeal was accepted as long as he paid for his own flight engineer training, which he also did, and he was eventually able to obtain a Boeing 707 flight engineering license. As a result, he was then rehired by Saudia in this new position and later upgraded to the L-1011, which is how he found himself in this cockpit. The final report also indicates that the flight engineer may have suffered from dyslexia, which is a condition that makes it more difficult to read and write, but the report doesn't specify whether a specialist had officially diagnosed him or not. But under any circumstances, if we look at the complete picture of this crew, I want to make it clear that this composition was really unusually poor. Each of the 3 flight crew members had fewer than 400 hours on the aircraft, and 2 of them had less than 200. All of them had struggled in training, and 2 of them had actually failed out of training and had then been reinstated for reasons other than merit. Unfortunately, at the time, Saudia didn't have any system to prevent inexperienced pilots from being paired together like this, which is something that most airlines nowadays keep a close track on for this very reason. But another issue that I personally think is really important to point out is that this crew was consisting of crew members from several different countries and cultures. The flight crew consisted of 2 Saudi pilots and 1 American flight engineer, and the cabin crew came from several different countries, most of them from the Philippines. Because of this, they would have had to communicate entirely in English, which was only the native language of the flight engineer and one of the flight attendants. Now, that's not necessarily an issue if the crew has been trained to use clear communication strategies, crew resource management, standardized terminology, and so on. But in Saudia in 1980, they wouldn't have received much, if any, training in these areas at all, particularly not in CRM, which is crucial in the way that we pilots today communicate and delegate tasks. But that concept was just starting to be developed at that time and was not at all widespread, and we're soon going to see exactly how that played out. Anyway, after completing the boarding process for their second leg of the day, the aircraft was almost completely full, with 287 passengers and 14 crew members on board. The captain was going to be pilot flying, so he briefed his 2 colleagues about what they were soon going to do, and then they completed the final cockpit checks, asked the cabin crew to close the doors and arm the slides. At time 2050 local time, flight 163 pushed back from the gate and the crew started up the L-1011's 3 Rolls-Royce RB211 engines in sequence. After this, they asked for taxi clearance and soon the aircraft started taxiing out towards the holding point for runway 30. All the checklists were completed normally, and at time 2108, the giant aircraft started accelerating down the runway for takeoff. The initial climb was completely normal, so the tower controller soon handed the flight over to Riyadh Radar, who cleared the crew to begin their turn toward Jeddah and continued the climb to the cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The pilots completed the after-takeoff checklist, while the flight engineer radioed company operations to provide an estimated time of arrival. Everything was going completely according to plans at this point. But just 6 minutes and 54 seconds after takeoff, as the aircraft was climbing through about 15,000 feet, the first indication that something was wrong was suddenly heard in the cockpit. An alert tone sounded along with a warning light at the flight engineer station, and the flight engineer immediately identified that the B smoke detector had tripped in the aft C3 cargo compartment. This was indicating a possible fire on board, which is one, if not the most serious emergency that an aircraft can ever face. Today, even the smallest indication of smoke and fire is treated with the highest level of precaution, and as we will soon see, that's for good reasons. But what was actually triggering this warning? What had started it? Well, the answer is that we don't really know for sure, but we do know that some sort of fire had indeed started in the C3 cargo compartment, probably near the top of the luggage pile. That fire had eventually produced enough smoke to trip one of the 2 smoke detectors in the hold, generating that alarm in the cockpit and automatically also closing off all ventilation air to the affected cargo hold. And since this was a Class D compartment, the design assumption was that the fire would run out of oxygen before it could reach the fire-resistant Nomex liner that surrounded the hold, meaning that no fire extinguishers were available. Testing would later show that in a compartment of this size, a fire hot enough to breach the liner could be sustained for as long as 10 minutes, with only the oxygen already present in the compartment. Because of this critical design flaw, the fire soon broke through the surrounding liner, gaining access to the space between the cabin floor and the cargo hold, and the unlimited oxygen supply available in that space. This meant that from that point, the fire was in reality uncontrollable, and soon started varying from high intensity as oxygen was sucked into the C3 hold to lower intensity as that oxygen was depleted, breathing like a big belching monster. Now, an uncontained fire on board is an absolute nightmare. I would personally much rather lose both of my engines simultaneously than face one of those. And studies have shown that in cases of uncontrolled in-flight fires, the average time between the first indication of smoke and the complete loss of the aircraft is about 17 minutes. So all of our smoke and fire procedures today tell us to initiate the diversion towards an airport immediately, and in some cases even consider an off-field landing. But back in 1980, a lot of the accidents which has led to this understanding hadn't happened yet. So the initial response to this first alarm was characterized by utter confusion by the pilots. It took almost 45 seconds for the flight engineer to clarify what was meant by a smoke detection in B aft cargo. And once he had done so, the captain appeared to believe that they could continue the flight as long as smoke detector A had not also tripped. This indicates that he might have thought that it was just a false alarm and didn't pose any significant threat. But 1 minute after that first alert from smoke detector B had started, detector A also triggered, proving that there was indeed smoke present, at which point the captain asked, "So we got to be returning back, right?" That would have been a good idea, but instead of leveling off and beginning that immediate turn back, the captain instead allowed the plane to continue climbing while he called for the cargo smoke checklist to be performed. Now, the way that Saudia had arranged their checklist turned out to also be a bit of an issue here. You see, checklists related to failures and warnings were divided into two categories called abnormal and emergency, and the checklist booklet had no index tabs that would tell at a glance which page the desired checklist was on. Instead, the crew had to look at the table of contents and then find the appropriate page. But in this case, the flight engineer appeared to believe that the checklist for cargo smoke would be in the abnormal section, where it was actually in the emergency section. This meant that he spent nearly 3 minutes flipping through all of the abnormal checklists without finding the checklist that he was looking for. And I want to mention here that whether or not the flight engineer had dyslexia probably wasn't that important here, since the checklist design would have confused most people. But of course, the dyslexia probably didn't help. On the other hand, this was also a checklist that the crew would have been practicing during their relatively recent type rating, so it's not a complete excuse either. Anyway, at one point as he was searching for this checklist, he also ran a functional test of the smoke warning circuits and confirmed that the alarms were indeed genuine, which probably wasn't that necessary to do nor a good use of his time. And at around time 2019, he finally simply stated that the procedure was not in the book. He instead suggested that he should go back into the cabin to see for himself whether there was any smoke or fire, and the captain accepted that suggestion. After the flight engineer had left, the captain instructed the first officer to request a turn back to Riyadh, by which time they were already around 60 nautical miles away from the airport and still climbing. The captain then apparently picked up the checklist booklet himself and almost immediately found the cargo smoke checklist, which prompted him to say, "By the way, he's a jackass. In the abnormal, it is in the checklist." Now, the fact that the captain called the flight engineer a jackass behind his back is something that I think is really revealing about the relationship between these three flight crew members. What it says to me is that the captain didn't trust the flight engineer to do his job or know what he was actually talking about. And that meant that anything that the flight engineer would have told him was going to be filtered through this lack of trust before he could decide on whether or not to act on it. This is important to keep in mind because almost all of the information that the captain would get about the fire, its progression, or what was happening in the back would come from the flight engineer. Anyway, at time 20 and 16 seconds, the flight engineer returned to the cockpit and announced, "We've got a fire back there." Seconds later, the captain finally halted their climb at 22,000 feet and began turning back towards Riyadh, while the first officer informed air traffic control that they were coming back and requested the fire trucks. But he never made any official emergency call. Now, this action to turn back was clearly taken with some level of urgency once the presence of a fire had been confirmed, but unfortunately by this point a lot of time had already been wasted. Flight 163 had spent more than 4 minutes since this first smoke alarm activated, flying in the wrong direction, whilst also climbing an additional 7,000 feet. These factors combined had extended their time until landing by several crucial minutes. Moments after the turnback had begun, a flight attendant suddenly slammed open the cockpit door and reported, "Fire in the cabin!" By this point, the fire had most likely completely breached the Nomex cargo liner and was therefore spreading freely into that 20 centimeter high void space above the cargo compartment that I mentioned before. This would have caused more smoke to rise up through the cabin sidewalls and emerge through the ventilation grills, sending large bursts of smoke suddenly into the cabin, which obviously would have terrified the passengers in the back of the airplane. From that point, the cockpit voice recorder continuously captured the flight attendants using the public address system to urge passengers to remain seated and to avoid panic. They did this in 3 different languages and apparently did a great job, because later examinations of the trim movements from the flight data recorder showed only small changes in trim during the flight, which would indicate that most passengers remained in or close to their seats. Meanwhile, the first officer told air traffic control that the fire was now in the cabin and that they had a full load of passengers, but that he didn't know the exact number. And while he was doing that, the captain told the flight engineer to go back for a second look. Now, when the flight engineer stepped out into the cabin again, he apparently noticed that there seemed to be less smoke than before, and he also couldn't see any flames. So he quickly returned back into the cockpit and said, "It's just smoke in the aft." Now, remember how I said that the fire was breathing in and out based on the oxygen supply? Well, testing later showed that the initial breach of the cargo compartment would have released a large burst of smoke into the cabin. But after that, the airflow could have reversed, drawing the smoke back down under the floor again and out through the cabin outflow valves. And this could have caused the smoke in the cabin to temporarily decrease, and it's probably why the flight engineer thought that the situation was improving. In response to this report, the captain said that they were on their way back to Riyadh, to which the flight engineer said, "Okay, no problem, no problem, no problem. So we're going to be returning. Everybody's panicking in the back though." The captain didn't acknowledge that comment, nor did he say anything to suggest that he understood the implications of it. Panic is a pretty good sign that things were in fact not improving in the back, and in this case, smoke and flames were likely readily visible to the passengers, not to mention that earlier report that they had received from the cabin crew. Moments later, when the captain tried to adjust the engine power setting, he suddenly discovered that the number 2 thrust lever didn't move backwards. It was stuck in position. This was most likely because the throttle control cables for the tail-mounted number 2 engine passed under the cabin floor in the area where the fire was now raging. As the fire spread, it likely melted the support brackets holding up the cables in that area, and then, as the fire moved on from that location, the material then re-solidified, causing that cable to jam. The captain now said that he wanted to shut down the number 2 engine, but before he could actually do that, a flight attendant again entered the cockpit and reported that there was now a fire near the L4 exit and that they had tried to put it out using the handheld fire extinguishers. That had, of course, been impossible because the real fire was actually in the cargo compartment under that area, which the crew had no access to. So the only thing that they could do at this point was to try and fight the part of the fire which was reaching the passenger cabin. In any case, the flight engineer responded to this report by simply stating, "Well, go put it out," a sign that he still hadn't understood the full magnitude of this situation. You see, the combination of a dual smoke alarm, visible smoke and fire in the cabin, and failures of completely unrelated systems like the thrust lever getting stuck can only really mean one thing: an uncontrolled fire. If I would receive this information, I would frankly be terrified and would probably be looking at the distance to the airport, trying to judge if I had enough time to actually reach it or whether I should be considering a forced landing instead. But on Flight 163, there was no such discussion of time, urgency, or alternative options. In fact, there was a noticeable absence of leadership at all. The captain didn't articulate his view of the situation or what his plan was if the situation escalated any further, and he also didn't communicate with the cabin crew, something that is absolutely crucial in a situation like this in order to assess the urgency. The cabin crew are our eyes and ears in the cabin and are really the only way to establish how the passengers are doing and how the fire is progressing. It is probable that the captain's attention was mostly focused on flying the aircraft at this point, which he was actively trying to maneuver into a position where they could quickly start intercepting the approach. But what he should have been considering, in a perfect world that is, would have been to instruct the first officer to fly the airplane, which he would have been more than capable of doing. That delegation would have freed the captain up to take command of the situation, gather all information that was available, and develop a strategy to ensure the safety of the aircraft, which is basically the exact reasons why we have a chain of command with the captain at the top in the first place. But by continuing to fly the airplane, this now left the captain without much extra mental capacity to complete this crucial task, and that would have therefore decreased the situational awareness of the entire crew. As the descent towards Riyadh continued, the flight attendants soon stowed the refreshment cart in the underfloor galley to free up some space in the cabin in order to be able to fight the fire more effectively. And as this was going on, the pilots engaged in a lengthy discussion about the status of the fire trucks down on the runway. At time 2023, the captain and first officer began running through the descent checklist, while the flight engineer configured a pressurization system to let down the cabin pressure to 2,000 feet, which was the airport elevation. In the background, cabin announcements could still be heard again, urging passengers to remain seated and instructing flight attendants to grab more fire extinguishers. Moments later, a flight attendant came into the cockpit and reported, "There's no way I can go to the back after doors R2 and L2 because people are fighting in the aisles," indicating that the chaos in the cabin was now getting much worse. By this point, the aircraft was on course to intercept the ILS in a normal but fast descent and with around 28 track miles still to go. Over the following minutes, the pilots asked the air traffic controllers to send the fire trucks to the back of the airplane after landing, while the flight engineer repeatedly just tested the smoke alarm system for no particular reason. Here, a functioning crew would have instead helped the captain to communicate clearly with the cabin crew and come up with a plan, but that just wasn't happening. The first officer was only responding to direct commands and reading the checklist, not being proactive in any particular way. And the flight engineer was mostly just mumbling to himself, saying things like, "No problem, piece of cake, and I think it's all right now." This mumbling was directed to no one in particular and might have been just a sort of coping mechanism to keep himself calm. But it is possible that the captain took these statements from the flight engineer literally, which might have caused him to believe that the flight engineer was seeing indications that the situation was actually under control. Remember, the flight engineer was speaking English, which was not the mother tongue of the two other pilots, so they might not have picked up on that self-calming tone in the statements. This is just another example of why training in communication strategies in a multicultural cockpit is so very, very important. Obviously though, the situation was not under control and the cockpit voice recorder kept capturing more and more desperate passenger announcement and shouting as people now started getting out of their seats to escape the acrid smoke. Entering final approach, the pilots extended the flaps and declared that the runway was in sight, but they still didn't communicate with the cabin crew about what their intentions were after landing. In fact, at time 2031, a flight attendant came into the cockpit and asked the captain 3 separate times whether they should evacuate, but he just didn't acknowledge any of those requests. Instead, the flight engineer stated that they should evacuate on the ground, but the flight attendants would have been trained to take this order only from the captain, so they still needed his instructions. 1 minute later, as the pilots finished their approach checklist, the flight attendant again asked the captain whether to evacuate, but he just told them to take their positions for landing instead. Shortly after that, they received clearance to land, and the captain finally shut down that jammed number 2 engine. The pilots then extended the landing gear and verified that the 2-engine landing procedure was the same as the 3-engine landing procedure, while the flight attendants urged the passengers to not panic and to prepare for the landing. Throughout the next few minutes, the cabin crew could be heard continuously instructing the passengers to sit down and adapt the brace position over and over again. At time 2035, the flight engineer tried to get the captain to clarify the evacuation instructions, but despite repeating his questions twice, the captain still didn't acknowledge him. Instead, the captain could be heard singing softly in Arabic, which is another possible coping mechanism. Moments later, more warnings were received, including an erroneous cargo door open indication caused by the fire destroying the wiring to that warning itself. And they also received a loss of power to the B hydraulic system, which was powered by the now shut down engine number 2. And then, from out of the blue, the captain suddenly said something really shocking. "Tell them not to evacuate." Now, nobody acknowledged this comment, nor is it known whether this was ever passed to the cabin crew, but nevertheless, it was a really baffling thing to say under these circumstances. With a fire on board, the top priority on landing has to be to get the passengers and crew off as quickly as possible, which means stopping the plane on the runway using maximum braking, followed by an immediate evacuation with minimum possible delay. We don't know why the captain thought an immediate evacuation was unnecessary, and we will probably never do. But there are two theories about the captain's behavior here that is worth keeping in mind. There is some evidence that suggests that the captain might have actually been unaware that an uncontrolled fire was burning on board his aircraft, possibly due to that flight engineer's comments about everything being okay and the more favorable report that he received earlier on during the sequence of events. There would have been a positive pressure differential between the cockpit and the cabin that could have kept all of the smoke out, which is further supported by the fact that none of the pilots ever donned their oxygen masks, and that could have helped the captain maintain that misconception. If he thought that the fire had been contained or put out or was never serious to begin with, then that could explain why he didn't view the situation with the appropriate urgency. But personally, I think that he knew that he was in a serious emergency, but had become so stressed that he was simply reverting to deeply learned behaviors. If you remember all the way back to when I talked about the captain's training history, one of the comments there was that he had difficulty deviating from set routines, which I think is highly significant here, since this situation demanded extraordinary action. He was also slow to learn and was new to the L1011, so being faced with a novel and very serious situation might have been so stressful to him that he fell back on what he knew, which was essentially to make a normal landing, just get the aircraft down on the ground. And that obviously didn't involve an evacuation of the airplane. At time 2036, as they approached the runway threshold, the flight engineer began to call out their height above the ground. 100, 50, 40. And at this time, a loud squeal, growing in volume, began to take over the cockpit voice recording as the fire started destroying the wiring to the cockpit voice recorder itself. This meant that just after the flight engineer called out 30, the recording completely stopped. So after this point, we don't really know for sure what happened in the cockpit. Anyway, a few seconds later, the aircraft touched down normally on runway 01 in Riyadh, and witnesses could see black smoke trailing from the outflow valves on the underside of the fuselage. Now, I have to give some credit here to the pilots for successfully landing the plane with an uncontrolled fire on board and with only 2 engines, despite everything, but just landing the plane is just not enough. You also have to get the crew and passengers out safely, and this is where the story of Flight 163 now started going in a bizarre and very dark direction. At this point, the proper emergency procedure would have been to, like I said, apply maximum braking, stop on the runway, shut down the engines and order an immediate evacuation, but that didn't happen. Even though the brakes were powered by the faulty hydraulic B system, investigations later would prove that the aircraft's full stopping was available. The brake accumulators would have had enough residual pressure in them in order to apply up to 4 applications of max braking. But instead of slamming on the brakes, the captain now let the aircraft roll out slowly, almost all the way down to the end of the nearly 4,200 meter long runway. The entire rollout took almost 3 full minutes, an excruciatingly long time when there's a fire raging in the back. And if maximum braking had been used instead, it was calculated that the plane could have been stopped a full 2 minutes and 24 seconds sooner. Now, there is a possibility here that the captain knew that he had loads of passengers standing in the aisles in the back and didn't want them to fall down and hurt themselves. But if that was the case, he would have also been well aware of the emergency and would have therefore evacuated immediately once he finally stopped. But that didn't happen. As the fire trucks started following the plane at low speed down the runway, the flow of smoke out of the aircraft suddenly stopped. This was possibly due to the flight engineer turning off the air conditioning packs, as well as him possibly doing some other switching on the air conditioning panel on short final. Now, the packs were supposed to be switched off at a later stage according to the procedures, but not this early. Anyway, with the air conditioning packs off, airflow through the cabin now suddenly ceased, and up until that point, the smoke had been drawn towards and out through the aft outflow valve, but without that airflow present, the smoke now drifted unhindered upwards and into the passenger cabin with deadly intensity. Before the plane even came to a stop, thick, acrid smoke would have flooded into the rear part of the cabin, causing passengers to flee forward away from the choking blackness, pushing, shoving and fighting. The 14 cabin crew members, many of them young women, would have had no chance to stand up against this chaotic flood of panicked people. And while this was happening in the back, the captain leisurely steered the aircraft off the runway and onto a taxiway, where he finally brought it to a complete stop and set the parking brake. On the tower frequency, the pilots now asked air traffic control whether the firefighters could see any fire, but at that stage nothing was visible yet. The firefighters gathered outside the aircraft with their trucks spraying foam onto the fuselage and waiting for the evacuation to start, but it never did. And in fact, at this point, the engines were still running, which presented a serious risk to the fire crews if they were to get too close, so they simply held back at the moment. Seconds later, the flight crew informed air traffic control that they planned to shut down the engines and evacuate. But as the seconds dragged past, neither of those things initially happened. The pilots might have been trying to shut down the engines before starting the evacuation, which is the proper procedure to do, but that should have taken seconds, not minutes. It is possible that the shutdown process was prolonged due to the chaos in the cabin and sudden ingress of smoke into the cockpit. We will just never know for sure. Now, flight attendants are trained to initiate an evacuation on their own if there's a clear and obvious danger to life, and the forward slides still could have been usable, even if the engines were running. But even if the cabin crew wanted to start the evacuation at this point, they were probably unable to do so, given the absolute chaos that was now unfolding. Most of the 287 passengers had now crowded into the forward cabin and galley area, where they were most likely packed so tightly against the doors that the flight attendants couldn't even reach them. By this time, many people would have also started to succumb to the toxic smoke, which contained deadly gases such as carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. And in fact, in most fire situations, it's actually these gases that will kill people first. One of the firefighters who accidentally inhaled some of this smoke would later report that even a single breath of it left him feeling sick for over 2 days. Towards the back of the aircraft, firefighters could now see flames in the last 3 or 4 windows on the left-hand side, but they could, of course, not reach that fire with their hoses from outside of the aircraft. Now, I used to be an airport firefighter myself, and according to my training, what we would do here is to try to open 2 doors on opposite sides of the aircraft to establish a little bit of airflow. We would then try to assist the evacuation or enter the plane with our breathing equipment and fire hoses in order to fight the fire directly. If we would do that, we would initially use the widest nozzle setting on the hose to push the smoke in front of us and out through the other open door as we move down the length of the cabin. This is known as ventilation and can also be done using the water cannons on a wide setting towards one of the doors. It is super important to get rid of that toxic smoke and fumes as soon as possible in order to have a chance to save anyone in a situation like this. But unfortunately, the firefighters at Riyadh had no such training or equipment. In fact, they had virtually no training at all, and most of them had never even fought a even simulated fire. They also didn't have any specific training on the L-1011 or any other aircraft, which would have allowed them to identify and open the doors from the outside. And even if they would have been able to open those doors, they didn't have the personal protection equipment that would be needed in order to enter this smoke-filled interior. By this point, it might still have been possible to save a few people with a very aggressive entry, but there was no way that this was going to happen. Instead, everyone just watched on helplessly. At time 2040, air traffic control asked, "Saudia 163, do you read?" The flight crew replied, "Affirmative, we're trying to evacuate now." And that was the last transmission that was ever heard from Flight 163. The engines continued to run for another 2 minutes until they were finally shut off at time 2042, and that was the last indication of anyone on board still being alive. A fire needs 3 elements to continue to burn: heat, oxygen and fuel. And if you remove one of those, the fire will immediately go out. But the mix of those elements are also super important for the fire's intensity. By this point, due to the lack of ventilation airflow, combustible gases had been building up in the cabin for long enough to reach a concentration perfect for something known as a flash fire. So, only moments after the engines were shut down, the entire cabin therefore burst into flames as the gases ignited, incinerating everything and everyone inside. At that point, anyone who might have still been alive amid the dense smoke would have been instantly killed by the intense heat, the lack of oxygen, and that left no hope for survival. When the flashover happened, it could be seen outside like a sudden puff of smoke coming out of the aircraft, and the firefighters now attempted to open a door while standing precariously on top of a fire truck, but they couldn't figure out how to operate the lever, so that attempt was soon abandoned. It took a full 23 minutes after the engine stopped for the firefighters to be able to open the R2 door, and when they did, they were just confronted with an ominous, smoke-filled darkness and silence. They called out to anyone still inside, but there was no reply. Now eventually the fire also burst through the ceiling of the cabin, and with that the fire crews were able to finally put the blaze out by dousing it directly with water and foam from the trucks, but at that point it was obviously far too late. After gaining entry to the still smouldering airplane, they found the bodies of all 301 passengers and crew, most of them lying on top of another in the forward cabin, having perished together as they were making their last desperate but futile attempt to escape. The pilots were found still sitting in their seats, where they had died without having managed to ever get the final evacuation started. The tragedy of Saudia Flight 163 is still well remembered today, not only as one of the deadliest accidents in aviation history, but also one of the strangest, most mysterious and most avoidable. The cause of the fire was never determined, but there's little doubt that if the aircraft had turned around sooner, stopped as quickly as possible and evacuated immediately, most or all of the people on board would have probably survived. The investigation faulted the flight crew for their poor communication, judgment and decision-making, which led to their failure to act with the urgency that the situation required. The managers and the airport were also faulted for having neglected to provide the required training and equipment to their firefighters. A number of safety improvements were made as a result of this tragedy. Saudi Arabia totally revamped its firefighting services, while Saudia improved the design of its emergency checklist, overhauled its evacuation training, eliminated the airflow from the C3 cargo compartment on all of its L1011s, and they also made sure that such inexperienced crew members could no longer be rostered together. The accident also caused the National Transportation Safety Board in the USA to issue an urgent recommendation to the FAA asking the agency to reconsider the certification criteria for Class D cargo compartments. This happened after fire tests had shown that the L1011's C3 compartment was not nearly as fireproof as was previously thought. But unfortunately, the FAA didn't act on this recommendation until yet another deadly accident had occurred. In 1996, ValueJet Flight 592 crashed shortly after takeoff from Miami, Florida, due to a fire in a Class D compartment, which wasn't equipped with smoke detectors or fire extinguishers. And finally, as a result of that accident, the FAA permanently eliminated the Class D designation. This means that today, all baggage compartments must have built-in smoke detectors and fire extinguishers, greatly reducing the likelihood of a similar accident like this ever happening again. I would like to end this video on a more positive, if still bittersweet note. There was one group of people in this story who did not only everything right, but also went above and beyond the call of duty until the very end. And those were the flight attendants, most of whom were young women under the age of 25 who had immigrated to Saudi Arabia to support their families, likely never imagining that they would be faced with such a terrifying emergency. And yet, they rose to the moment, maintaining relative order in the cabin while also organizing a titanic effort to battle the inferno, leaving a trail of empty extinguishers in their wake as they retreated before the advancing fire. There can be absolutely no doubt that they died as true heroes. So in the end, I hope that their deeds will serve as a shining example of how we as aviation professionals should act in circumstances like this. Thank you so much for watching, and consider subscribing to the channel and check out my other videos in this series if you found this one interesting. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.